Hi folks, Harry Frank from Red Giant here, and in this tutorial I'd like to show you Compound Blur from Red Giant Universe. Compound Blur is a blur effect that references another layer that we'll call the blur layer. We can look at the luminance or the alpha channel of that blur layer and drive the blurriness of the image. So we can vary the blurriness of the image from one spot to another. So let me show you how this works. Let's start from scratch with a piece of footage, and I'll go to my Red Giant Universe plugins and select Universe Blur, Compound Blur, and apply this to my image. Now I need a second layer to drive the blurriness here. So I'll create another composition and I'll call this my blur map. And inside here, I'll create a solid. And to keep things simple, I'll go to Effect, Generate Circle. Let's turn up the radius, go to the feather, and feather this out. So this is what my blur map will look like. The areas that are white can be very blurry, and the areas that are black could be zero blur, or we could flip this around and do it the other way. So I need to get this blur map inside my original composition. So let me drag this in here and turn it off. Now I'll go to my Compound Blur, select the blur layer, and select that blur map to drive the blur of the image. So if I turn up this maximum blur, that's the maximum amount of blur that will be applied to the image. So where the blur map has that circle, that's the maximum amount of blur, and then as it feathers off, it goes down to zero blur. Now I need to flip this around so that the edges are blurred and the center is clear. So I'll go to Invert Mask and check that box right there. I think there's a little bit too much blur going on here, and I think we could benefit from scaling that original blur mask up a little bit. Now I could go into the pre-comp, but I could also go to the mask scale here and scale this up. Now it's worth noting that the mask channel defaults to the alpha channel. So it's looking at the transparency of the image. Now if you're looking to use a luminance map, I can set this to a normal blending mode. Now I have the white circle on black. I would have to go to my Compound Blur and set the mask channel to Luma. We have an option to show the mask here if you happen to need to take a peek at it. Another handy thing is the ability to move the mask position. Now, being that I've scaled this up a little bit, we don't actually see the edges of the mask. So I can move this mask around to follow the movement of the video. Next, I'd like to show you using Compound Blur as a motion graphics tool. So we can definitely use Compound Blur on things like text, perhaps to create sort of a reveal for this text. So again, we're going to need a blur map. So I'll create our composition here. This will be our text blur map. Now I'll create a solid here. I'll just make a white solid, and I'll use the alpha channel of this. So I'll go to my ellipse tool, draw something out from the center, and I'm just going to make sort of an ellipse like that. Tap F to go to my mask feather and feather this out. I'm going to animate this mask so that it moves from the center of the screen to off center. So let's go to our mask path by tapping M. I'll move forward a second and a half, go to my mask here and use my selection tool, double click on the mask and move it off screen like that. So the text will go from very blurry, and then we'll have it gradually reveal itself through the Compound Blur. So let's put this text blur map into our composition. Turn that off, go to Compound Blur and define that blur map. Let's turn up this maximum blur so we just barely can't read that text. And we are using the alpha channel, so as I play forward, we should see this text reveal itself. Pretty easy. You notice how quickly it renders and how high quality the image is, even at this lower quality. Let's bump this up. Still renders pretty quickly, even at a quality of 4. Now, this option right here, Preserve Original Alpha, if I check this, this will preserve the original alpha channel of this shape. This means that any blurring of the alpha channel is not going to happen. So what this is useful for is essentially blurring the surface of the image. So let me go to my generators here and apply a grid, and I'll put this before the compound blur. I'll go to the blend mode and set this to cutout. Turn off the compound blur so we can actually see this. Maybe I'll turn up the thickness here. So I have this grid punched into the text. Now if I apply compound blur to this, it is simply going to reveal what is on the surface of the text rather than blurring the alpha channel of the text itself. Now these next two here, blend mode and opacity, don't necessarily apply to the motion graphics example that I'm using here, because if I set this to blend, it's essentially going to blend the blur with the original image, creating sort of this glow effect. And I don't think this is very useful for blurring your motion graphics with compound blur. This is more useful for footage, where we would like to blend the blur with the original image to create sort of a glow kind of effect. Maybe using an add blending mode or something like lighten. So we're blending the glow back with the original image, and I can control the opacity of the blur that is blended back in using this slider right here. So that is Compound Blur, one of the many free plugins from Red Giant Universe. My name is Harry Frank. Thank you so much for watching.